Hello, welcome, greetings from the Mosel. Thank you for listening and watching today. Today we're talking about fermentation, wild yeast or indigenous yeast, spontaneous fermentation. These are all words that you come across when you're interested in wine, when you taste wine, drink wine, and you talk to winemakers and to wine specialists. What is this? How does fermentation happen and how can it happen and what variations are there? Well, there are actually two ways how to ferment a juice into a wine. You can either just fill up the barrel and wait until it starts to bubble, until it gushes over, and until the yeast that are naturally there, the indigenous yeast that are in the juice, start to ferment and turn the juice into wine. And this is what we call spontaneous fermentation because it happens spontaneously. You find yeast everywhere. There are airborne yeasts in the air, there are yeasts in the barrels, or there are yeasts in the cellar, and of course there are yeasts in the vineyard. Yeasts are everywhere, just like germs and bacteria are everywhere. And I made the experience that the yeasts are mostly coming in from the vineyard, because I remember once buying a brand new barrel that has been, of course, toasted a little bit and heated up in order to bend the staves and create a barrel. And this barrel could impossibly carry any yeasts in there because it was also closed and sealed. And I brought the barrel in at harvest time and I filled it up with juice the same day I got it. And the next day the juice had started to ferment. So obviously the yeast must have come from the vineyard and they were not already in the barrel. Another version of fermenting is for several decades now, of more than 50 years, winemakers are able to buy yeasts, one straight poor yeast strain, just as you can buy, for example, yeast for your yeast dough to bake a cake or bread. You can buy yeast in a little bag and you add this yeast to the juice, and what happens then is that all of a sudden you create the dominance of just one yeast strain, just one kind of yeast cells that all of a sudden takes over the fermentation and does not allow any other yeast strains work beside it. And of course that's a very simple but anticipatable kind of a fermentation, because imagine you have a soccer team and the soccer team consists of clones of only Lionel Messi, and they're all the same. They're very strong, very fast, very quick, very flexible, super soccer players, but it's all the same. And this might be a little bit boring. Maybe they play a good game, but it's all kind of the same, and it's not very natural as well. That means what can happen here is that when you use the cultured yeast, then you have yeast cells that put only the fingerprint of this one kind of a yeast cell and its metabolism on the wine, which means you have certain flavors that are very present, very dominant, and it can happen that you have a wine and you smell the wine and it has a lot of one kind of a flavor, let's say apple flavor, and you like it, and maybe you're able to pin it down to a Golden Delicious apple or a Granny Smith apple, and then you say, yeah, this is very typical apple, and you like apple, and you smell it again. Maybe you're happy in the first place, and then you drink it, and you do that 10 times, and then all of a sudden you say, well, it's just apple. And that is very boring. It is almost disappointing, because you buy wine because you want wine and no apple juice. I mean, if you want apple, you buy apple juice, and it's less expensive than wine. It's more simple. But wine is different. Wine is culturally on a much higher level than juice, because it doesn't only taste like one fruit. Wine has a complexity. There are a lot of flavors, and there should be a lot of flavors and not just one flavor. And the more flavors there are, the more complex the wine is, I find a more high-leveled it is, and the more quality it has, the more it has to offer, the more interesting it is, the more it appeals and makes fun to drink and also to talk about it. That's why I myself, personally, I prefer the spontaneous fermentation, because it creates much more individual wines. I make wine in 7 different single vineyard sites. And I don't want these wines all to taste the same. I want my wine from the Saar to taste like a Saar wine, and I want my wine from the Mosel to taste like a Mosel wine. And I even want my wine from the Bockstein vineyard to be a typical Bockstein, and I want my wine from the Goldtröpfchen vineyard in Peaceport to have the typical character of the Peaceporter Goldtröpfchen. I want this guarantee of origin in the taste of the wine. And I think that's the most honest and true expression of origin that you can get. In order to work successfully with the own indigenous yeast, you have to provide enough nutrition and the right environment for these natural or indigenous yeast, which are quite vulnerable, they are quite sensitive. You have to make sure that you work your vineyard intensively, so make sure you put enough compost or maybe manure or natural organic fertilizer in the soil. Make sure you cultivate the soil. I have to make sure that there's a very accurate and good canopy management done. I have to make sure that the grapes reach a full physiological ripeness. All these things are very important if you work with indigenous yeast. That's why it is really something for a high-leveled quality winemaking. And this is why you have to think in interdependent steps. It's not one step after another. Each move, each procedure in winemaking is dependent on each other, and you have to think holistically. You have to think on the long run. And that's what I do. That's what we do here at the winery. And that's why you could call this kind of a winemaking and viticulture, which all depends on each other and all creates one big thing. That's why you could call it artisanal or handcrafted. It's not like buying clothes from just one brand that all looks like the same, but in different sizes. Like you can buy suits from one producer, from one tailor, and it's all the same. This is hand-tailored. This is really very individual wine. And a friend of mine always explains the spontaneous fermentation in a quite funny way. He says, working with cultured yeast or adding cultured yeast to the juice to have a very safe and controllable fermentation would be like inviting your neighbors for a dinner party, and you know they're punctual, they arrive on time, you know that they can behave, you know that exactly what will be the topics you talk about, you know that they will leave the house again at maybe 11:30, and it was quite a nice evening, but very boring and not really interesting. But if you put, and that would be the spontaneous fermentation, if you put an invitation on Facebook or somewhere in the internet that today there's going to be a party at your house, you don't know how many people are going to come. There might be as many as 1,000 people standing in front of your house. You don't know if they're punctual. You don't know if they behave. You don't know how much they will drink. You don't know what is going to happen. And they don't know when they're going to leave. But there's one thing for sure: you're going to have a heck of a party, and that's what spontaneous fermentation is like. It's not as controllable, but a very interesting and exciting way to make wine. That is something that I like. I like the individuality. So I hope I could explain you a little bit how the different kinds of fermentation work and what are the advantages and the disadvantages. I can just say cheers now, and I hope you're going to enjoy a good glass of wine. And the most important thing is that you like the wine, and that's why I say cheers and greetings from the Mosel. Thanks for joining us.